And Laura is going to take us through the last topic, so I can take some notes and alleviate the burden for that.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And our colleagues from Pearson are on, and I'll just invite you all to chime in when you would like. Either just raise the hand, and we'll call on you, because this reflects a lot of the great work that you've been doing. So this conversation is intended to sort of close out the discussion of the score gain analysis that we had in September and we had in June, and kind of dates back to that initial memo from the Stanford, the CETA project, and which our TAC member Ben was somewhat involved with, right? So rather than what we wanted to do today, not moving. We're not planning to provide a detailed summary of the prior conversations and analysis. Instead, Pearson prepared a nice memo that was, shared with you with the materials before this meeting, that kind of gives an overview of the rounds of analyses that they conducted, including some analyses that they did in response to some recent feedback from TAC members and from the broader field. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of that, and again, would invite Pearson to chime in if they like. And then what we'd like to focus this conversation on is identifying analyses that the TAC thinks should be incorporated into future score releases as a way of ensuring quality and comparability of performance over time, and then also discussing recommendations for public communication about score trends moving forward. So as background,
can I just add one point of sort of clarification on that? This is particularly important to us that we have strong evidence on which to sort of make claims about comparability and interpretability, because we just finished talking about the fact that there will need to be ongoing continuous changes to our assessments, but yet we don't want to sort of break our longitudinal trends. And so as we do this, we need to do it in ways that are thoughtful, and that we continue to sort of probe rigorously. So I just need to sort of lay that foundation. The test is never going to stop and be frozen. It's always going to continue to evolve, and so we need to have ways of assessing the impacts of those evolutions. Thanks. Sorry, that was all I wanted to add.
No, super helpful. Thanks, Ray. So the sort of abbreviated overview of the history here. So in February 2024, Sean Reardon and Aaron Foley, am I pronouncing the name correctly? Bailey, thanks. Identified some potential concerns about the validity of gains on the IAR, particularly in ELA and particularly in the middle school grades from 2022 to 2024. Around the same time, there was a memo from the Chicago Consortium that identified similar concerns focused on analyses of Chicago public school students' performance. We, as I mentioned, engaged in some discussions. These were in closed sessions in both the June and the September 2025 TAC meetings. In both of those meetings, TAC members raised several hypotheses regarding the potential causes of the score gains. I should note that the original memo from Sean and Aaron also had raised some hypotheses and recommended some analyses to address those, which Pearson subsequently conducted. Since then, TAC members and others have been communicating about continuing questions, and there have been some suggestions for additional analyses. And then in the meantime, as we've been talking about throughout these 2 days, ISBE has engaged in a standard setting and a redesign of the accountability system. So we're kind of at a point now where a lot of things are changing, and we need to be thinking about, okay, let's figure out how we can, as Ray said, be confident going forward in how we describe and interpret trends. So in response to these discussions that I just described, as I noted, the Pearson team conducted several rounds of analyses. There's a memo that was shared with you, that's document 8.2, and then there's also a folder there with some supplementary materials. And I know several of you have already kind of read through those and given them some thought, which we appreciate. You know, in response to that, there's been kind of several rounds of responses, and again, I won't go into to great details about this, but I will just note from the September TAC meeting minutes, this is a quote, "The TAC generally agreed that there does not seem to be anything wrong with the mechanics of the test itself, and that there could still be reasonable explanations for the increase, such as student engaging more with the test in response to teacher encouragement." And here's a table that is adapted from that Pearson memo. And so this is on the left-hand side these are the hypotheses that were originally laid out in Sean and Aaron's memo and that we subsequently discussed at some of the TAC meetings. And then on the right-hand side, just a very quick overview of the evidence that came from from Pearson's analysis. And so without belaboring this, the analyses kind of showed, you know, didn't show strong evidence that any of these hypotheses were the factors driving the score gains. We did note, and Pearson has noted, that more detailed analyses could be done, and particularly thinking about the writing items. So we taught, and Angela just talked about the heavy emphasis on writing and the integration of writing and reading on IAR, which is not a characteristic of the NAEP reading assessment. So one of the hypotheses is that some of these gains have to do with both the IAR's emphasis on writing and the likelihood that educators...
and its unique performance items, not to say that there aren't performance items on other tests, but IARs are particularly unique. They are a type of performance task that is unlike almost any other assessment.
Yep. Yeah. And so there's some, you know, that's one potential reason. We don't know definitively what's going on.
Right. We do not.
But we just want to kind of put that on the table. So the questions that we have for you today are, you know, what are the empirical analyses that you would recommend to be included in the annual monitoring plan? So that we can conduct these kind of continued, and Pearson can conduct these continued analytic checks on some of the issues that were raised in that scorecard analyses. We'd like to think about which ones are really critical and which ones are optional, just recognizing that everybody has limited resources. And then finally, given the new performance standards and the redesigned accountability system, what advice do you have for ISBE about how to communicate score trends going back to 2024 or earlier years? How can we sort of help folks understand how to apply appropriate caution when thinking about those trends that precede 2024?
So can I just offer a comment, since I was one of the ones who raised additional issues about, you know, looking at I was truly impressed by what Pearson did. Tracy, if you're on the line,
Yes, she is.
it's like, I thought that it was a very thorough, look at a lot of issues where, you know, there were hypotheses about things that might have produced perturbations. And I think the whole issue here, actually, for including this is what procedures are in place now and going forward to ensure comparability, equating, because that's really what we need to think about. Because the importance of the role of the assessment in the accountability system, including now the SGPs as well as baseline SGPs. So, but I do think that, at least from my perspective, a lot of the things that were questions, and like there still are questions. Well, how much is writing contributing to things? You know, as I told some folks, you know, the fact that it doesn't track NAEP, that doesn't bother me. NAEP is a different assessment. So, from my perspective, I'm satisfied that the concerns that we had, that things had gone awry, partly not because of anything ISBE did per se, but the fact that we had several things happening simultaneously including that period where the contracting shifted, and then it wasn't clear whether equating was going on or what, et cetera. I think what all the work that Pearson has now done and documented at least satisfies me that there's no smoking gun there that we can actually point to. But it really does assure me that this is the right question is, okay, how do we do this going forward? I just add one sort of, personal comment. When the 2024 gains showed up that led to the back and forth with Reardon et al. I was at other TAC meetings, and I had very knowledgeable colleagues on those TACs asked me, how could it possibly be the case that the score gains in 2024 are at all reasonable? What the hell's going on with your assessment? And so I think that's really the issue. Under what circumstances do we need to be looking for, potential anomalies where all of a sudden there's this enormous gain at a couple of grade levels or whatever?
Agreed. And I want to just appreciate both the TAC and Pearson for taking these allegations very seriously, doing more than due diligence in terms of, looking at, because again, we agree, we want to have confidence in what we see. And so it's, which is precisely why, is there anything, Jim, that you would recommend moving forward that we absolutely incorporate? I mean, I'm thinking about, if there are areas of alignment that we want to address, if there are areas where we want to specifically, try to add additional dimensions to cognitive complexity at the higher and lower ends of the scale, where we, again, know there is less precision. What are some of the analyses that we might consider to ensure, again, just a reminder, we do pre-equate. And so, but yet Pearson essentially runs a post hoc post-equating every single time.
Yeah.
So we would know if, but I mean, what else might we think about?
Well, I think that, it's a hard question to ask because in essence, with any of these programs, especially when you want to monitor trends over time, don't change the measure, don't change it so substantially.
Right.
And your scale is not preserved in the interpretation of scores on the scale. I think, there's constant change in the assessment because you're always changing items, but so it's a hard question to answer because at what point is it a different assessment and you sort of say, okay, it's time to break trend. Okay, which is the inevitable NAEP question, as opposed to feeling, I guess it's the point of feeling comfortable in terms of what you're reporting and how people are supposed to be interpreting it in terms of the level of achievement of the students in the states relative to your standards and then the other thing is then change over time. And I think the change over time is critical because now in the accountability system, you have SGP two ways. And it's not a problem with respect to the cohort analysis, but the baseline. And then the issue, what defines your baseline?
Right. And that may be a question for the TAC to consider moving forward is, do we possibly take both tests and re-baseline on 2025 so that the baseline SGP is using the same baseline for both high school and except there's a part of me that again, like this, I'm sorry that it raised so many questions for colleagues in other states and other professions, but actually for us, but at the K-8 level, baselining on 2019 has been very important in understanding student recovery post-pandemic. And I understand again that it doesn't make sense given some of the triangulated data. And for the record, that's my favorite thing when different data elements aren't telling a coherent story. How do we interpret that? But it certainly matched our hypothesis that with the vast investment of resources and emphasis on learning recovery in ELA and math, that we would see accelerated student growth. And so I just didn't know how long we would sustain it. It is meeting my expectations that as the funds expire, we are starting to see that regression back to more 2019-like rates of growth. So, I mean, to me, I guess not to say that I didn't question it, but but that I had a series of hypotheses that were aligned to our context for which the data did fit. So that was just something that I kind of I think it's a very interesting question. What kinds of analyses would we do to help the TAC sort of, give a recommendation to rebaseline in 2027 off of 2025? Like, what might we do to prepare for that kind of shift? Because that certainly would have implications for the accountability system. That's a question.
Yeah, Ben, did that spark anything for you by any chance?
Yeah, well, I have a few things. So yeah, I think as Laura mentioned, kind of like as a disclaimer, so I work very closely on the CETA Education Recovery Scorecard Project. I'm a member of the development team, so I've done a lot of work to build those data sets. I didn't actually, so this is one thing that was confusing to me. The report that Sean and Aaron wrote was actually February 2025. I know the document says February 2024, so when we're going back and reading it, it's gonna be hard to remember. It feels like, but it must, I'm confident that it actually was a February 2025 report because it uses 2024 test score data.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the report is
And
February
that's like,
2024 on the
yeah,
cover.
that's gotta be a
Yeah.
typo.
Yeah.
And I think there may have been some version of it or some flagging of it before the NAEP results were available. I can't
Right.
put the pieces together either.
Yeah.
Well, we've
So,
only been looking at this for a year.
right, so I think February 2025 is maybe. In any event, so I didn't help to write that, but I reviewed versions and gave them feedback, so I'm very familiar with everything in it. And I also want to echo Jim saying I think the work that Pearson's done, so my other disclaimer is I'm new to this and I'm still trying to catch up and sort through all the different materials that I've now just been given access to in the last few days. But I do want to echo Jim. I think it seems very thorough and I don't see any obvious issue. I think they've done the kind of thing that would make sense. I think what remains to me, and I'll try to get to your question about analysis we could do moving forward, is that the setting aside any comparison to NAEP, because I agree that's interesting and anomalous, but it's not really what we're kind of charged with and directly about here. I still think that the changes in scores from 19 to 22 to 23 to 24 are, I've never seen anything like it, looking across many years of state assessment data in all 50 states. And I don't think there's an answer in the things that Pearson have done to say, yeah, we can now explain why we have this essentially first ever result after thousands of different combinations of tests over time, maybe hundreds. So I still think there's kind of this open question as to how is it that scores increase so much, in particular in grades 6 and 8 ELA. And the things that seem most surprising to me are how large the change was if you look from 2022 to 2024, and in particular 23 to 24 in grades 6 and 8, and that it suggests the conclusion that students in 2024 were achieving at much higher levels than their grade level peers in 2019. Does that seem plausible? I'm not sure, right? I mean, it seems surprising because students in 2019 hadn't experienced all the pandemic disruptions. So that still kind of seems like an open question. And then also, why is it only in grade 6 and 8?
Yeah, right.
Right? Why were students, why were the 5th and 7th graders the year before not doing much better, and why were the students other grades not doing much better? So that still kind of remains open. So the one thing I haven't seen in the analyses that I think might be somewhat helpful, and then I think to be reported going forward, are 5-number summaries or something similar of the scale score distributions at each grade level. So everything in the again, the report by Reardon and Faley and others have been based on proficiency results. And I think there was the point made that can be a little misleading, right? If there's a fairly small change in scale scores, but it happens right near a proficiency threshold, that can sort of magnify things.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to know what the changes in scale score distributions look like over this time period.
Very reasonable.
In terms of minimum, maximum, mean, SD, things like that.
Yep.
To see if maybe when you look at those full distributions, it's less of an sort of, doesn't look quite so stark or large.
Yeah.
And I think that might also help to understand what sorts of comparability can be made in these trends, because we know in 2025, the cut scores change. So proficiency just can't be compared now to any previous years. But in theory, the scale score distributions could be compared.
Correct.
So I think looking at those to see whether there's also a question about that comparability would be very helpful.
I think that's an excellent suggestion.
And then I did have one clarifying question after reviewing the material, which is, and you mentioned the substantial emphasis on writing in the IAR tests. And has that been true kind of like since 2015?
Yeah.
Or is that a more recent?
No, it's been that way. In fact, if anything, so the history of the Park assessment has been one of reducing those rigorous to reduce test time. But no, the expectations around writing in response, like in sort of deep connectedness to stimuli, texts of a variety of sources. That's been present since 2015, and that is one of the central claims that, as whether it was Illinois Independent or consortia / state collective driven, preserving the ability to maintain that claim with confidence has been a theme throughout.
And I guess there was results here. Has it always been the case that, can I refer to things in the results we were given and like that were not part of the?
So we just need to, have some sensitivity to proprietary. This is an open meeting. We can talk in generalities, just maybe not specifics.
Yeah. Well, I have questions about the exact content makeup of number of items for reading and writing and things like that, but I can follow up.
Yeah.
But one thing that did change then is when the original park design, when they went to what's called the shortened ABO blueprint, one of the things that changed was one of the extended tasks. So previously there had been 2 major reading, writing performance tasks. And I can't remember, one of them involved, if I remember correctly, literary text, and another one involved informational text. And so when they went to the ABO design, a kid got one or the other. And then there was a lot of analyses done by I guess at that point it was New Meridian and others, that there still was equivalence or comparability in terms of now reporting with the reduced one. And I think this came up because there was a lot of concern about SGPs, because if, for example, a kid one year got the literary and the next year maybe didn't get the literary, they got the informational, with this, and then Damien and others were involved in extensive analyses that basically said, no, there's not a problem here. But that is a change that has carried over since before 2019. I can't remember when the
Yeah, that
APL
actually happened in roughly 2019 was when we were first doing those analyses.
Yeah.
And so to be clear, like there was from 2015 to 2018, there were changes made to reduce testing time, but it did not remove. There were three. It's that there were three major writing tasks. An LAT, which is the literary analysis task. The I know the one is the research.
Yes.
And then what's the other one, Tracy?
The NWT, the narrative writing.
NWT, narrative writing task.
Mhm.
And it was that we always maintained the research because
Right.
that is the one that is so directly related to, but you could alternate between the literary analysis and narrative writing tasks.
Mhm.
And so you always have two even
Right.
now. But
Mhm.
yeah, so that happens at all grades. And so again, it's just kind of, so we did that in 2018, 2019, but the ABO was in use by multiple states from basically 2020 on. Again, we administered ABO in 2020, didn't we, Tracy?
Yes, and I can speak a little bit in more detail
Yeah,
about
we were
that.
one of the few states that had any results in 2020 because we had
Right.
such an early testing window.
Oh.
And we had about 2 weeks worth of testing results, but that was 80% of Chicago. Right. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And if I could just say a little bit more about that study, there were actually 2 years of studies that were conducted to investigate the results of what the shortened blueprint would look like. And the studies were done with Pearson and New Meridian collaboratively. So again, there were 2 sets of psychometricians and content folks looking at those results. And the shortened blueprint, to Ray's point, actually does have both literary points and points that come from reading for information. So the final blueprint, the literary analysis task and the narrative writing task both measure literary stories. It's just the focus of those 2 literary tasks are slightly different, but that's why the blueprints could be ascertained to be very similar. The thing that's different between them is that the literary analysis task, PCR, has 4 additional points that go to a literary. That goes to a literary points that go beyond what the narrative task does. That's the only difference between them. Everything else is the same. So they're very, very similar in construct.
And
Thank you.
yeah, and Tracy, since we had that conversation earlier about, additional analyses moving forward, I was wondering, as part of you having now done all of these analyses for the memo, have you sort of like adjusted your internal processes? Are you including certain kinds of checks in years moving forward by any chance? Was there anything that stood out to you?
Yes, I did want to speak to the analysis that Dr. Scheer spoke to about looking at the distributions of scale scores across years. And that is a task that Pearson does do routinely during the equating process. What I will say, though, is that we do it for the years upon which Pearson sort of owned the equating process, and we started owning the equating process in that 2024 year. Looking back to 2023 was New Meridian's last year, then we had it 2024. So going forward, we look at all of the data going forward. So we do always look at the distributions. We look at the percentage of students in each of the proficiency levels. We look at all of those things before the scores are released. That's a standard thing. I will also say that for this analysis that we were doing and sort of investigating this, is I did look at technical reports sort of going backwards. All of the technical reports for IAR are on the website. They're public available information. And in the appendix, you can see the cumulative frequency distributions across the scale scores for all the years. So you can go back and you can look at those on your own. Prior to this TAC meeting, we did not have time to compile sort of putting all of those together. And I will also say that, again, some of those years were New Meridian years, some of those years were Pearson years. So I don't even know that it would have been possible for us to compile them into one complete graphic, but the data is all there. So anybody, if you would like to look closer at that, Dr. Shear, it's all there. You can look at those cumulative frequency distributions because they're there. And also, ISBE does have this sort of online tool that has that has a lot of data as well, that you can select years that you want to look at and go deeper into the data as well. So there are ways to look a little bit more closely at those distributions that you can see more of that on your own.
Yeah, the challenge I found was that the New Meridian report in prior years reported distributions pooled across all the states participating.
Yeah, but I
so that
just
wasn't available. But I think I'll look more and see if that's like.
well, but that's a so please do, but also understand that as the composition of the consortium changed over time. Illinois represented a substantial portion of that pool, particularly as you approach the 2020 to 2023 years. I mean, New Jersey was still there, and they're big, so I don't want to say that there mightn't be things that are specific to Illinois. That's absolutely a possibility. But those were interesting times for every state. I remember New Jersey having some real challenging assessment choices to make at that time.
Just as an aside, DC was part of that as well.
They were, but DC elected to continue to administer the full form, to my knowledge, in all years.
No, they didn't.
They didn't?
They
Last
ultimately have gone to the ABO.
Okay, last time I heard, they were, when I left and took a break from being assessment director, they were still using the long form.
They had used it as long as they could, but there was no way that they could, there was nobody to continue to do field testing for certain things. So they had to go to the ABA. But this is just an aside, because I'm on the DC TAC. And when we've looked at the DC results over time, and because Pearson is the contractor for them, I raised the question and I said, well, we have this issue in Illinois. Have we seen it in DC? And they have not seen it in DC. Now, I also discovered, and again, that the group from Pearson that handles the DC assessment is not exactly the same group that handles the Illinois assessment. In fact, the group from Pearson didn't even know about the Illinois issue. So I don't know how you establish, I mean, yes, everybody's using the park thing, but they're using, however they're building their version of it, including Illinois one, is apparently unique to Illinois.
And that was, again, just to me, this is all a fact. Like, someone needs to write the history of this, because that was part of the intent in bringing in New Meridian, was that states could use common development, have a common scale, have common sort of design elements, but yet still customize in ways that were appropriate to their state context. That was intentionally one of the stated goals of that shift, and we saw that play out all throughout 2020 to 2024, and now we are continuing to see that occur. Ultimately, we continue to believe that the way in which the IAR is structured is a good way to assess the skills and knowledge that we care a great deal about. Obviously, there will continue to be political pressures to reduce testing time and testing burden. those are legitimate. I'm not negating those. But there will always be then a tension with the desire to do that and the need to maintain longitudinal trends and to fulfill the requirements of accountability systems. And in that delightful milieu is where this discussion is. And so again, I love the suggestion that we look at those score distributions. I think some of the recommendations from the alignment study in terms of being more clear about some of these details and so on, like that feels like an excellent way to also address some of these ongoing concerns about, confidence in interpretability and so on and so forth. So
and I just indicate that, like Ben, I do have some concerns about the issue of going all the way back to 2019 through. But on the other hand, I think maybe this is an auspicious moment because you've now done a standard setting where people are looking at items and performance on the current assessment. And so that is your sort of frame of reference. And assumedly that the scale you have now, the assessment you have now is one that you can make sense of. And it's where your standards are going forward, recognizing what you said, that even though the cut scores have changed and the performance categories, you can still go back to the scale and look at that over time. The question is, how far back do you want to go? How far back is comfortable in terms of looking at those, using that as a baseline for computing, because it is in your accountability index. It is now there's a baseline SGP. And that's the one that I think maybe concerns me, which is how far back, where do you establish the baseline?
is there, I'm genuinely curious, to your knowledge, is there any kind of standard on that when other states use, because I know we're not the only state that uses a sort of growth metric that baselines to a particular moment in time, because the folks that hate our use of SGP are constantly telling me that we need to benchmark and baseline at a particular moment in time. Is there sort of a standard to your knowledge? Is 5 years typical? Is 7 years considered too far back? What do we know, if anything?
The only thing I know is that because of the pandemic, what people did was they used 2019 because it was something where they could at least say, okay, before that, up to that time, everything was normal. After that time, but I think that was in part so people could look at issues of loss, quote, loss and recovery.
Right.
But we're now at 2026.
Maybe it's time to let that go.
Maybe it's time to let that go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again,
I'm checking with Damien, see whether he has a quick answer. He seems to be on.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. And I do think the Illinois situation is a little bit unique in that there were these questions raised about these kind of unusual gains
and perfectly legitimate questions they were.
I did want to mention, and this is relevant to, I think, going forward as well, but one of the initial hypotheses for those gains is there was a change in instruction, in curriculum or instruction, and that actually those gains reflect that change. And so, and I know the state invested in sort of recovery, and offered professional development. And so you could tell a story where, we invested heavily in writing professional development and we saw teachers implementing across the middle. So I'm making that up, but I do think that as we're going forward, in addition to kind of all of these analyses of the test itself, it's going to be important to really be looking at what's happening in schools and in districts that could explain certain changes, whether positive or negative in scores, just kind of understanding that broader context.
Yeah, and I hear you. I agree with you 100%. I am challenged with how to actually operationalize that suggestion.
Yeah.
In that, even the question, what curriculum do you use, is not an answer. They can tell you what textbook they use if they have one.
But they can't even tell you how much they use that textbook.
Right. And so getting like interpretable data has
sure.
been such a challenge. And where I struggle is it is a massive investment of time and resources to get the accurate qualitative answers. Any attempt at sort of quantifying or making that more survey based is it inevitably falls prey to data quality critiques.
Sure.
And yet anything less than that full investment of resource into qualitative research in this topic is dismissed as anecdotal, justifiably, right? Or cherry picked and so I just I am very intrigued to if there is something the center could do to help us sort of understand how other states might be approaching answering those questions. We certainly aren't the only local control state.
No, and I certainly not suggesting anything incredibly time intensive or resource intensive. I do think it's worth talking about some ways to do that. And even if it's sort of quote anecdotal, it still kind of helps build that case for validating a particular hypothesis. So if, for example, the state rolled out some new professional development, you may not know what the uptake is across districts, but that's helpful information to kind of just provide that broader context.
I know in Rhode Island, for example, they have very strong early literacy initiatives, and they have specific funds allocated to this, and they were wrestling with this as well. And they trying to remember what exactly their constellation of efforts were, but they were sort of in the last technique, they were like, no, we are being much more deliberate now about how we collect it to the degree that we can. So we can do certainly something like that for you. And
I think too, though, that this is one of those things where, like, I don't know how much capacity we have to look backwards, but certainly looking forwards as we roll out the new statewide system of support. Being able to build in some of that data collection is definitely an opportunity. And there have long been folks who have been calling for this kind of data. It is not, to be very clear, it's not that this is a new idea. It's just it has always been a very challenging thing to operationalize.
I checked with Damien. Damien said many states are starting to move away from 2019 just because it has been so long ago. So I think that gives you credence to sort of shifting it. And I just personally, I do think it makes sense to me too. It is such a time where so many foundational things have been changing, and also, I mean, there is this part about the psychology of it all, of getting people away from this sort of saying, like, are we still in the pandemic recovery mode, or are we actually from this new point?
So
go ahead.
I do want to just be very clear. I don't think that's something we could operationalize for the 2026 data reporting year, right? But if that is one of the recommendations of the TAC moving forward, I would ask that come forward as a recommendation more formally, in the sense that that would be something that we would have to include in our ESSA state plan. I mean, again, I don't think Ed can stop you from doing that. It doesn't require their pre-approval. I mean, every state gets to choose their what they baseline off of, but it is always one of the questions that they ask. When is, if you're using any kind of a baseline SGP or any other growth measure, when is your baseline year?
Can I ask you to just clarify something?
Sure.
For 2026, you're saying that a change in what is the baseline could not be operationalized, and I'm not sure I fully understand. I realize.
Because I haven't communicated it to the field, I would have to get
Okay.
the approval from our state superintendent. That's a
Okay.
really big change to
And-
roll out right before testing begins. It's not appropriate. While it may be something that could happen, it is not something I can make happen in the broader context in which it sits.
That's very helpful, because I also was wondering what in the context of what's already built into the state ESSA plan, whether or not you've identified specifically that 2019 is the baseline.
Right
And that
now.
would have to change as well, so.
Yeah, right
Okay.
now it is,
Yeah.
and so it would have to change. And that's certainly, I mean, we identified that 2025 would be the baseline for high school, so there's nothing to say that we can't.
How many prior years does the SGP model use?
Just two, so your current prior, and at its current and
Yeah.
prior, and then the third prior when it exists. Every student for which both can be produced are produced.
So the 2019 baseline is 2019 predicted from 17 and 0, for example.
I would defer to Damien on the specifics. That's where I start to get just a
Yeah,
teensy bit fuzzy.
I'll check with them when I'm having
Yeah.
it. Ray, in terms of your need for having a discussion today, like getting insights, I think we are in a good place, and we are sort of at that point where we are sort of out of the official time
Yeah.
for the TAC meeting beyond public comment. Okay, and if that sounds good to you, then I would say, yeah, that's we gonna reflect all the recommendations in the minutes, and then you can take another look at that. And also, I recommended, I noted the suggestions about sort of getting a little bit more of a landscape analysis on some of the practices, so that you have a little bit more of a backing there.
Yep.
And also the note on like if there was indeed like a consensus based agreement that a new baseline of 2025 is meaningful, that we've more formally captured that in a memo.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, we now have a few minutes for public comments. If there's anybody who would like to share something, please. This is the time, and we're going to record that. We're not going to respond to that. We're just going to record it, and then we can discuss that internally afterwards. So, is there anybody out there who would like to share something? And again, it can also include notes of appreciation.
Yes, Andrea, this is Paul Zavakovsky. I guess
Hi,
I'd like to just say a few things here before you adjourn for the day.
Yeah.
First, I'd like to thank ISBE, Ray in particular, and the TAC for discussing this whole thing in open session. I know that there have been previous discussions, but to my knowledge, they've all been in closed session. So I think it's really helpful for this to be something that everybody in the state can get access to, even though this is wonky stuff that's going on here, and many people, don't have an appetite for that. I guess the two things I'd like to just comment on. One is it was really helpful to hear the discussion from Pearson in particular, that the idea here is that the analysis really has only involved those years when Pearson has owned the process. In my own, limited view, I think it would be at least worth considering going outside that range, simply because it feels to me like there are a number of possible equating and calibration problems that occurred well before 2024 that might still be impacting the way things are going. But that's, I'm at the edge of my competence on that, so I like to openly acknowledge that. The other thing I'd just like to close with is that I think it would be helpful if we're making cogent arguments to the public for why we can claim comparability with 2019 and make pretty strong claims about the kind of progress that's occurred, particularly at the middle school level with middle school ELA. I think it would be helpful for the public to also understand that there have been some counter narratives here, in particular the counter narrative that came out of the Educational Recovery Project from NAEP, as well as a counter narrative that came out last spring from the consortium work that was referred to a little earlier. I think it would be helpful for the for the public to understand a little more clearly why it is that, or how it is that that counter narrative is occurring and what might be accounting for it, to explain why ISBE has not opted to dismiss it, but has viewed it as something that is kind of less pertinent to the conversation than the evidence that's been collected with the you've been referring to through most of the session. And I say that only because I think there's at least a good possibility that when the 2026 NAEP data appears at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, it is entirely possible that we'll see the same discrepancies in the 2026 NAEP as we saw in the 2024 NAEP. And I would like to hope that there'd be a good explanation that would be worked on prior to that to be able to help explain what might account for those discrepancies, because I know the press will be spending a lot of time looking at those discrepancies, and they won't do a very thorough job of examining all the ins and outs of why those discrepancies might exist. So I'm hoping that there'll be this preparation not only would be looking backwards, if it is time to move on from this stuff, okay, but would also be looking forward to the possibility that these discrepancies will appear once again, and the kind of discrepancies that were pointed out in the consortium report might also appear once again, and those things are going to be difficult to get rid of. So, in anticipating those things, I guess is the kind of thing that I'd hope that ISBE and the TAC would take seriously going forward. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Recorded, noted. Is anybody else who'd like to share anything? Hearing nothing, I'm going to do the thing that I did yesterday. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So then we thank everybody who was listening in from the public. We also want to thank very much Pearson for all of their hard work, really, and taking the time to be here today. We want to thank all of you here, the TAC members. Especially the new ones. We hope you had some fun and you learned some things and this is helpful. And again, the door is always open for like inspirational ideas. So if something sparked with you today, and we are going to talk about internally, like what the follow-up opportunities are for getting together on certain topics a little bit more deeply, so that sometimes the time is just limited, as we saw today with the alignment work, for example. But that being said, if there's anything else that you want to share, feel free. And I would say, Ray, maybe sending it to you, Angela, and Milton, and then maybe sending it to Laura and I, if you could include that so that we know also how the information is flowing.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
But please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you do have questions or thoughts, ideas. We love to hear it, and it's helpful. And as always, we will continue to do the very best that we can to have a high quality assessment and accountability program that we continuously improve. And one day, maybe, Jim, science assessment can flourish in Illinois.
Well, it sounds like it's working at 5 and 8.
All right. So with that, I wish everybody also a wonderful and safe trip home, given that it's snowing outside. Thank you so much.
Be safe.